Well, so much to talk about. I see you guys. You should be seeing me now. Ollie, Harris, LT should be viewing me now. Greetings, Eric. I'm not sure if it's Eric or Eric. Let me know so I can pronounce your name. You seem to be around a lot, and offering, if I could add, some fantastic comments. Thank you. Thanks for all your comments. I've said it many times on this show, but it bears repeating. Sort of like Eric. Okay. It bears repeating. Let me know as well if you're hearing any audio blips. I'm trying to kind of get this live stream tweaked so it's just perfect. Last couple of days I've been using one device, and now I'm using a different device, and hoping it's working okay. One thing I wanted to mention, you guys should be getting these live streams. YouTube recently, I think it was just in the last couple of months, they instituted a new rule whereby when you subscribe to a channel, you actually have to click twice. Good. Greetings. Fantastic to have you from Norway. Must be later over there, I would imagine. But it's it's about 3:40 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time here in Boston. But YouTube introduced a new button that you have to click on in addition to the subscribe button. So you click on the subscribe button, and then you also have to click on the little bell next to the subscribe button. And that way you can get instant notification of all the Tennis Talk Daily live streams, giving you the latest and the greatest in men's professional tennis. But we got to start talking about the women a little bit too. I just have such a hard time watching Halep, who seems to be dominating this year. I guess it was Kiki Bartends over at Cincinnati who came out on top, which was good. I had one viewer mention that Kiki Bartends would be the U.S. Open favorite. I think that was kind of a joke, although maybe not. I think that was LSB. She should be on here in a while. But, yeah, we might cover some of that. But remember to click on the bell icon. I'm going to repeat that a couple of times today because I had a couple of people yesterday who didn't get the notifications of these fantastic. Well, they're fantastic for me. I'm having a fantastic time in the live stream, so you're not getting a notification of them. That's too bad. You should at least be able to come sit in and make your decision rather than being deprived of the essential information about when Tennis Talk Daily is coming out with the live stream. Yes, I did hear through the grapevine that Federer was out practicing with Stan today. Any news on that racket? Is he still using the Black Beauty? I mean, he's going to be out practicing every day, folks. But whether he's using that racket, I know there was a lot of buzz on Twitter about that. But one of the stories that I thought was interesting for those of you who like Stefanos Tsitsipas, apparently Nick Kyrgios stated recently, and I didn't quote him in full in that little cover photo, but apparently he stated, and as far as I know, he's never played Stefanos Tsitsipas. So I don't know how Nick Kyrgios would know. Maybe they've practiced together, but he felt quite certain, Nick Kyrgios, the bratty Australian that we all love to hate, he feels certain that, quote, Tsitsipas is not a good player. This coming from the horse's mouth, Nick Kyrgios being the horse. And I think it's a very strange quotation. Listen, Tsitsipas is not as consistent as he will be one day. I can admit that. Let's talk a little bit about Tsitsipas. Let's talk a little bit about Stefanos Tsitsipas's year, his 2018 on the ATP circuit. Let's talk about that. it bears a bit of review, just so we can understand. He kind of did come out of the woodwork. He wasn't one of the people being, pointed to as a next-gen star at the beginning of 2018. Well, he wasn't performing very well at the beginning of 2018. There wasn't much there. There was the Australian warm-up, where he did have a fairly good run in the Australian warm-up at Doha, beating Florian Mayer and Richard Gasquet on his way to the quarterfinals at Doha, where he fell to Dominic Thiem. His next, he lost to Shapovalov in the Australian in the first round, and that was a straight set loss to Shapovalov. He was doing some challenger and a couple challenger tournaments early in the year. Didn't really post any good results until, well, listen, he beat Philippe Kohlschreiber in Dubai, and had a quarterfinal run in Dubai where he fell to Jaziri. Wasn't Jaziri the eventual champion? And then at Indian Wells, lost to Dominic Thiem again. I'm getting to your comment in a second here, Eric. Now, at Miami, there was that little exchange between he and Daniil Medvedev. I love pronouncing his name. Medvedev, there was some exchange between Tsitsipas and Medvedev, and there's a few people that didn't sort of take too kindly to Tsitsipas given his part in that exchange. Maybe said something about Medvedev's nationality or something to that extent. It was a little bit ugly. He lost. Tsitsipas lost in Miami in 3 sets to Medvedev. So the little mix-up didn't seem to do him well. But then he starts performing on the clay. You remember, at Monte Carlo, he has a fairly good run. He beats Shapovalov, redeems against Shapovalov in the first round of Monte Carlo, and then loses to some kind of effing Russian something. It was not one of his finer moments, Tsitsipas. He's a young guy. He's probably does have a bit of a temper. I mean, he hasn't demonstrated a real penchant for outbursts. He seems pretty even-keeled. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I like him. It's one of the reasons why I believe he has a good future. But in Monte Carlo, he did fall to Goffin. Divine David, one of our favorites. And I want to look at Divine David's year as well. He is someone, I think, who has a lot of promise. I enjoyed so very much watching him play in Cincinnati, and I'm hoping to God that his shoulder heals and that he is in fine form and feeling good fitness-wise at the U.S. Open. We want Goffin to be performing up to that very fine level that he's capable. A beautiful player to watch, and my favorite double-fister, my favorite two-fister on the circuit. But then in Barcelona, at a 500 level tournament, is where Tsitsipas really begins to shine, right? There, his run includes victories over Schwartzman, then Dominic Thiem, then Carreño Busta, before having to face the great Rafael Nadal in the finals of Barcelona. Of course, Nadal tears Tsitsipas a new you-know-what in that final. Good experience for Tsitsipas. Hello, Farzan. How are you doing? Nice to see you guys. Someone talking about Anderson. Anderson's injured? Is that something? I didn't hear about that. Goddamn, Anderson ripped his arm off. Well, no, maybe that's a figure of speech. Yeah, maybe Kyrgios is just sort of jealous. Well, the thing is, they haven't even played. As far as I know, they haven't played. They haven't had a competitive match. Maybe there's been some practice matches. I don't know how much you can glean from simply watching Tsitsipas, especially if you're going to make kind of an extreme statement like that. Now, let me, in Nick Kyrgios' defense, let me say that there was a bigger quote. It was, since I don't have that much room to quote in the cover photo, I didn't include the whole photo. What he said, to quote him holistically, as it were, is that Tsitsipas is not a good player, but he will be. That's what Kyrgios says. So Kyrgios, that wise old man who knows so much and can, that oracle of a wise old man, that gentle, wise old man, now I'm being sarcastic, makes a prediction that Tsitsipas will one day be good. One day, Stefanos, if you keep practicing, from Nick Kyrgios, one day if you keep practicing, you'll be pretty good. Well, I would have actually, if I were Nick Kyrgios, I would have shut up. I suppose I've had periods or times in my life when I've said things that I shouldn't have said. So I can sympathize with Nick Kyrgios for blurting out things that shouldn't have been said. Of course, he's more exposed than I am because he gets quoted all over the internet if he comes out with something even close to being controversial. I mean, with the Express UK in the picture in the tennis world, and they tend to just lead in the search results. They have such clickbait, but they can create controversy, create a revealing, juicy revelation out of virtually nothing. You click, we all probably click on some of their stories, but you get into it, and actually the stories, they don't lie in their stories. They just clickbait you with the headlines. They're very, I think, they have some, fair amount of journalistic integrity. Once you actually get into the story, they tell it like it is. They quote the players pretty accurately. I've never seen a misquote over there. But Nick Kyrgios must have understood that a quote like this would be circulated, disseminated. Yeah, Farzan. I mean, listen. They are exaggerations, but what I was saying in Express's defense, and they're kind of leading the market in sort of tennis media in terms of the textual media, written media. They kind of lead the market. You search tennis on Google, at least the way I search it on my Google. I keep getting Express, although Google might have tagged me as someone who read an Express story before. Oh, this guy must love the Express. Well, not really. I try not to read Express, but I don't even think this story came from Express. It might have, but I think it's an accurate quote. But the entire quote is, basically what Kyrgios is trying to say is the guy needs improvement. Okay, sure, he needs improvement, fine. But I don't think he can come out and say he's not a good player. No, not after what he's done. Let's talk a little more about what he's done. So he run into the finals at Barcelona, including a straight set win over the Prince of Clay, Dominic Thiem. 6-3, 6-2. That's impressive against Diego Schwartzman, the little engine that could. Almost beat Nadal, in fact, later in the clay season, but didn't quite do it. Carreño Busta, straight sets, and then, of course, he gets punished by Rafa. At the Estoril Open, he was able to defeat Kevin Anderson on the clay at the Estoril Open. Remember, top 10 player, number 8 in the world when that match took place. That was not a straight set victory. Tsitsipas won the second 2 sets. Anderson won the tiebreak, which was in the first set. Then Tsitsipas went on to play the very loud grunter, Carballes Baena. Carballes Baena is a real grunter. Tsitsipas put the grunting to an end on that day. And then, however, in the semifinals, went on to face João Sousa, who has to be one of the loudest grunters on the tour. Sousa. And that day I got upset because Tsitsipas is such a quiet worker. Like Federer and like really all my favorite players. Yeah, it's a good point, the service motion is on with Tsitsipas. I just got a comment about that. The service motion is less appealing. It has less aesthetic appeal than, for example, Roger Federer's. Nadal is louder. Well, he's probably more consistent with his grunting. I mean, the grunting kind of comes out. It was interesting, during Wimbledon, I was watching Nadal to see if he would be grunting more or less on the turf, which I thought was an interesting question. I mean, it strikes me that that on the grass, you probably, since it's not as much of a power game, there would be less grunting. And I'm not sure I came to a conclusion about that. Maybe there was just a little bit less grunting from Nadal. Can count that among the things that he adjusted in his game. I've said before, said in my last couple of episodes for you Nadal fans coming on, I have warmed up to Rafael Nadal quite substantially over the last couple of months. The Wimbledon performance was just so impressive. And I warmed up to him because he changed his game. He started playing with that kind of Federer-esque, it's kind of a difficult one to pronounce, that Federer-esque forward momentum in his game, really seeking to kind of construct points in logical ways and end points. Nadal is a much better point ender than Novak Djokovic, if you ask me. But in any case, we're kind of getting off the topic. So Tsitsipas falls to Sosa, who goes on, I believe, to win in Estoril, as I recall, although I forget who he beat in the final. If anybody remembers that, I'll be very impressed. In Madrid, Tsitsipas fell to Evgeny Donskoy in the first round after that deep run. After the deep run, of course, in Barcelona, and then doing okay in Estoril, he's out in the first round. That was a 3-set match. In Italy, a better performance. He takes out Coric. Coric is, as I like to say, no slouch. He's nobody's fool. Coric can play, but in that particular match, as I'm seeing and as I'm recalling, Coric actually retired. Well, then Tsitsipas went on to face Delpo, the Tandil Tower. Who thinks Delpo's going to be rocking it at the U.S. Open? Who thinks Delpo could pull out a surprise here and win his second Grand Slam? Well, he did. If you're saying, Patrick, he defeated, who defeated TFO? I'm missing that. In any case, Del Potro in Italy beat Tsitsipas in straight sets. And at the French Open, Tsitsipas fell to Dominique Thiem in the second round. Okay. So some flashes of brilliance during the clay season for Tsitsipas. Then on grass, he shows talent on the grass, I believe. I think very substantial talent on the grass, particularly in a few of these matches. I think the match against Jared Donaldson was the one. It did go 5 sets. It was in the second round of Wimbledon, but in the sets where Tsitsipas performed well, basically in the sets that he won, in particular, the first couple of sets and that second set, I mean, we got a glimpse of the Stefanos Tsitsipas, who I believe will eventually come out permanently and start to rack up major titles, start to stage major upsets against big players. I agree, Tsitsipas's service motion is not as aesthetically pleasing as Roger Federer's. Be interesting. I could do a little episode on service motions. I believe, there's a couple service motions out there that I don't love. Don't love Alexander Zverev's service motions. I generally do not like the step serves, the folks who step into their first serve or into their serves generally. Kevin Anderson is one of those. Isner. Some of the real big, tall servers use those steps. I don't personally use a step when I serve, and I think the steps can undermine or negatively affect the extent to which the service motion is aesthetically pleasing, but because it's really just a power move. Aaron from Interi, who is a big commenter. Federer's game has totally collapsed. The only thing that has not collapsed yet is his serve. Well, it's a pretty smart thing to say. It's an observant thing to say. Clearly, you've watched the matches. Although, as I said yesterday, Federer's serve was not of too much moment for Novak Djokovic. In that first game, Federer heard Djokovic was the one who knocked in Cincinnati, and he started knocking in the first game by creating 3 break points that he didn't convert. But it was a knock. Federer knew he was knocking. Well, but we can't make too many conclusions, too many permanent conclusions in Terry, because he was having a bad day, because he wasn't moving well. He felt that was his explanation after the match in Cincinnati. His footwork was not performing. Well, you could argue that the footwork is so fundamental. It's the core part of Federer's game. In a way, everything comes out of, everything flourishes out of the fleet-footed movements that Federer is capable of, that very incredible sense of intuition he has in connection with positioning himself. But what we were talking about yesterday is that Djokovic applies pressure by aiming shots to Federer's body and landing the shots to Federer's body, which runs contrary to Federer's forward momentum in his point construction. Djokovic drives Federer back. And I had a couple of commenters say that Federer actually should move back behind the baseline when he's playing Djokovic. Well, I remember the last time Federer moved back behind the baseline. Can any of you recall with me? Do any of you remember last time Federer was playing behind the baseline or playing further back in the court? I remember it in his match against Thanasi Kokkinakis. Remember Kokkinakis, the no-name who actually had a name for one day when he beat Roger Federer in Miami in Federer's opening round. That's the last time I remember Federer playing at the baseline, playing a little farther behind the baseline. I remember the announcers mentioning specifically in that match in Cincinnati that Federer was playing further back. I think a lot of people noticed it. Well, I do think that, again, the forward momentum is such a taking the ball early, moving his position in the court forward, sort of slowly but surely, or at least looking for every possible opportunity to do so, is such a central part of Federer's game. You take that away, you stick Federer back behind the baseline, well, then you don't have Federer anymore. And Djokovic will beat him behind the baseline. He'll beat him in different ways, not by necessarily going to his feet, because Fed's feet will be behind the baseline. But there's ways to do it. Rafa can beat him. Federer has his game. He has his way. He can't let go. He can't, abandon some of these core aspects just to kind of accommodate for one match. I don't think he needs to do so. Patrick Nielsen, I was so angry after that loss, though Federer deserved to win, because Kokkinakis, we're talking about the Miami first round now, because Kokkinakis lost in the next round to Verdasco while he was leading 4-1 in the last set tiebreak and lost it 7-4. Yeah, I mean, that was a very frustrating match to watch. Federer was just all deflated. I mean, he was just kind of on autopilot, I felt that day. There was nothing terrible, but I mean, it's so central for Federer to hold serve. I've said this before. I'll say it again. It doesn't make him a serve bot, but there is a relative. I mean, Federer's style, his game rests substantially on his serve. Not fully. I wouldn't say half. I mean, I wouldn't put a specific number on it, but I would say that relative to some of the other players, certainly relative to Nadal, certainly arguably relative to Djokovic. But then when you start putting Federer next to a player like, say, Del Potro, well, Del Potro, I wouldn't call him a serve bot, but in a way, the extent of the role of their serve in their respective games is about equal, right? They're big servers, but they have a good ground game. Actually, you probably would argue that really the serve is even a bigger part of Del Po's game than it is for Roger. It's a big part of his game, without question. It doesn't make him a serve bot. But if he can't hold it, if he can't protect that serve ruthlessly, he knows this. He knows this. I mean, really, it's not rocket science. So critical for him because he's a fantastic returner, but he is not the caliber of a returner that a Djokovic is and that a Nadal is. And that's just clear from the numbers. There's no dispute about that. Now, Federer can break serve. Federer can break very powerful serves, but he needs to have the kind of comfort of his own serve that will, it gives him a little room to move in his return games. But when you have someone like Djokovic breathing down his neck on his serve, returning those second serves right to Roger's feet, and then insult to injury if you have a day when Roger's not moving those feet very well, it can create real problems for Federer. His serve was just all over the place with Djokovic. So, I mean, listen, he needs to protect serve. If he can protect his serve, it does not guarantee the win, but it's pretty close. I've said that before, and I'll say that again. If Federer can merely, and it's not merely because it's not easy to do against returners of a caliber of Djokovic and Nadal and a few others, if he can just protect his serve, he almost guarantees wins if he's feeling good, if he's moving well. So I do think that, yes, we were just talking about the Kokkinakis match. We don't have to dwell on that. That was kind of a nightmare. One of the things I was talking about the other day is popularity of particular players on Twitter. And for those of you who have been following some of the live streams, we've noted, and I noted the other day, and I did a rough estimation of the numbers, and I just wanted to go back and report to you the numbers that I tallied up here in terms of followers on Twitter. And we'll just stick to the big three for now, because you know what? There are really no other tennis players, as far as I can tell, who have even close to the number of followers on Twitter that Djokovic does, that Federer does, than Nadal does. But between Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal, most, without looking and sort of speculating, I think one could reasonably assume that Roger Federer, he seems like the most loved tennis player of all time. Seemed like he'd be the most popular tennis player of all time. I mean, I've been doing this tennis channel for a long time now. When Federer's going strong, when Federer fever is in the air, I mean, the views pick up big time. He's a major draw. Now, the Rafa fans came out and supported Rafa during clay too, which was very impressive. But I just think, based on the evidence I had prior to examining this evidence, that this new evidence on Twitter, I would have assumed Roger Federer had more followers than Rafael Nadal. But it's not true. Rafa Nadal leads the pack, has more followers than Roger Federer or Novak Djokovic. 15.5 million followers. Now, he joined Twitter, Rafa did, in July of 2011. And since that time, he's tweeted 2,707 tweets. But I repeat, 15.5 million followers. And what does Roger Federer have? Well, again, if I were to make a guess here, I would say, okay, well, if Rafa's ahead of him, he can't be that far ahead of him. But Rafa has more than 3 million followers, more than Federer. He has 3.2 million followers more than Federer. Federer has 12.3 million. Nadal has 15.5 million followers. Djokovic is way down there, but Djokovic is far above someone like Andy Murray. I think Andy Murray has like 3 or 4 million followers. Djokovic has about 8.5 million, which is about 5 million less than Federer. But Djokovic joined Twitter on March of 2011, which was a little bit before Nadal. He and Nadal have tweeted just about the same amount of times. Nadal a little bit more, about 100 more tweets than Djokovic. But it's interesting. I mean, 2011 was one of the greatest years of Djokovic's career, wasn't it? And that the interim time from 2011 to now, like up through 2015, I mean, that was the age of Djokovic. You'd think he would have even more followers. Well, Djokovic is, I guess, notoriously. LSB is telling me to shut up. Okay. Well, Djokovic is, I guess, notoriously not very popular. I don't know why. I like him. There. So in any case, for those of you who are interested, but one last point, I will talk about tennis, but Roger tends to be late in the game a little bit here. He waited a long time to change his racket head. Well, he waited quite a while to join Twitter, and he didn't join until 2 years after Nadal. So that's part of the issue. Okay, enough with that. Let's talk a little bit about this set of finals. Well, I guess we have some semifinals teed up. To finish the point on Tsitsipas, then he does well in Wimbledon, falls to Isner in the fourth round at Wimbledon. Then in Washington has a semifinal run, beating David Goffin and Jared Donaldson along the way, but falls ultimately in the semifinals in Washington to the defending champion and eventual champion Alexander Zverev, and that was Zverev won 6-2, 6-4. But it was at the Rogers Cup where Tsitsipas came out of his shell again and started to just fly high. This run at the Rogers Cup, folks, was mind-blowingly good and impressive. He takes out Dominic Thiem in straight sets after doing away with Damir Dzumhur in the first round. Takes out Dominic Thiem in straight sets at the Rogers Cup. Then takes out Novak Djokovic on the hard courts of the Rogers Cup in 3 sets. Djokovic, the one set that Djokovic won was in a tiebreak, and Tsitsipas won the other 2 sets cleanly based on, I believe, single breaks of serve, 6-3, 6-3. There might have been a double break of serve in there. I can check that. Then, in the next match, he beats Alexander Zverev. Well, the comment I got on Alexander Zverev, I just got this from Kakduk Nguyen. Yes, I do believe that Sasha Zverev was not playing very well. Sasha Zverev actually had some comments after this. He did his best in these comments to, I think, take the wind out of Tsitsipas' sails. I mean, he basically said he played like crap. I mean, this is Zverev talking. He says, didn't play well, and that, the win can't really be too much of a big credit to Tsitsipas. There you have 2 players on the circuit. Nick Kyrgios, and Alexander Zverev trying to, like, I don't know, just trying to belittle, in a way, Stefanos Tsitsipas. It's true. And it's kind of the similar generation, right? Kyrgios and Zverev. Well, they're scared of that guy. They are scared of Tsitsipas. He did lose it, and it was not, was not pretty. I didn't watch every minute of that match, but well, let's look at the stats here. It was a 3-set match, as I said. Tsitsipas was able to, let's see, his serve stats were not very good, not getting even half of his first serves in, winning about 60% of his first serve points, and winning only about 52% of his second serve points. He saved 9 of 14 break points, and that was really the key to this match, folks. Stefanos Tsitsipas had a 100% conversion rate against Alexander Zverev. He was 4 for 4 on the break points against Zverev. Whereas Zverev was just, I think, way behind on the conversion rate. 36% he was able to convert 5 out of 14 break points. Well, not sure how all the math adds up, but this does look like a close match. I hadn't looked at these stats before. It does look like, but listen, I mean, in terms of the second serve points won, Zverev was way down on that, and you can't really blame, I mean, maybe Zverev could say he was having a bad day, but again, the second serve percentage is a big indicator of the returned ground game. And, it suggests when your second serve win percentage is down, it suggests that your ground game is not functioning as well as the player on the other side of the court. It looks, it indicates to me that you're up against a very impressive returner. So interesting. You do have those two people in the same kind of generational cohort, Zverev and Kyrgios, kind of putting Tsitsipas down. Maybe there's some passive aggressive impulse there. Maybe they're scared of him. Maybe they don't like him. Maybe they heard about that little incident with Medvedev. In any case, he goes on after he ousts Zverev, he goes on to beat Kevin Anderson, and that was a 3-set match with 2 tiebreaks. And then Kevin Anderson, number 6 player in the world. Alexander Zverev, number 3 player in the world. Dominic Thiem, number 8 player in the world. Tsitsipas beat 3 top 10 players in his Rogers Cup run. Then, of course, he fell to Nadal. But even with Nadal, things got a little interesting there in that second set. Remember, Stefanos pushed the great Rafa to a tiebreak. Then at the Western and Southern Open in Cincinnati, Tsitsipas fell to Goffin, who was on fire in Cincy. A little too much on fire. He kind of threw his shoulder out, apparently. I'm hoping he's going to be fully recovered for the U.S. Open. So that's Tsitsipas. And listen, he's recorded a fantastic year. He is a very promising player. He has demonstrated very impressive abilities, ground abilities, serving abilities on all the surfaces. Now that's something. And he brings a very beautiful single-hander. His service motion, as somebody was saying before, is not the prettiest thing to look at. And that's true. He kind of has it's interesting the way he kind of moves around the court. He's got an interesting kind of swing in his walk. Another player I wanted to talk about, as long as we're talking about kind of the younger players, particularly in connection with the Winston-Salem Open, is the young Taro Daniel. Now, you guys will remember Taro Daniel from the match at Indian Wells, where he beat Novak Djokovic in Djokovic's opening round match. Well, Daniel's having a very solid run here at Winston-Salem, and really I looked through his stats, looked through his activity record on the ATP site, and I'm not sure, other than the Djokovic win, which was very impressive, I'm not sure he had anything else that he could really kind of put a notch in his belt with. Well, he defeated Sam Querrey on Wednesday at the Winston-Salem Open. That was a 3-set match. And he lost the first set to Querrey, and then he took the second set 7-5, and then the third set went to a tiebreaker. It was a great match, and Daniel was able to oust the very hard-serving and very impressive Sam Querrey, who was the number 9 seed in the tournament. So that was impressive, and now he came through John Millman yesterday, and he's into the semifinal where he'll face a player that's been coming up a couple of times in this conversation. I hope these players are watching. I hope, Tsitsipas is watching. But Medvedev will be Taro Daniels' opponent in that semifinal. We'll have to see what happens. In the other semifinal at Winston-Salem, we have, let me check that. I've got my readout here. We're going to have Steve Johnson versus Carreño Busta. So Steve Johnson versus Carreño Busta in one semifinal. Taro Daniel versus Medvedev. I mean, the way Daniel is playing, and by the way, I suggested the other day that he wasn't a very tall guy. Actually, I was wrong about that. He's quite tall. He's 6'3". So big guy, big frame with Daniel. But I think he probably can take care of Medvedev, and we'll just have to see what happens. Those are interesting. But again, I guess the point about Daniel is that other than Djokovic and now Querrey, I mean, there's not really much else. So he seems to me be maybe breaking through. He's American-born, but he's playing for Japan. Seems to be doing a really good job. I'm going to be watching him more in the coming weeks, and I'll kind of give you more reports on that. We don't have any matches occurring. Those matches are going to occur later, those semifinals at Winston-Salem. So let me see what the comments are looking like here. Do we want to talk a little bit more about the draw? Yeah, that's right. Unhinged Obesity. You could see the Tsitsipas versus Medvedev. Correct. Let's check that out. Yeah, I mean, Tsitsipas is in that second quarter of the top half of the draw. Not sure who he's even playing in the first. He's going to play a qualifier. And in the second round, unless it's Evgeny Donskoy, if Evgeny Donskoy beats Medvedev, and in which case, in both instances, whoever Tsitsipas faces in the second round, I think it's going to be someone who's beaten Tsitsipas before, because Donskoy's beaten him and Medvedev's beaten him. So that'll be a good, proving to himself that he can take those guys. Again, he might have to deal with Coric. You might see a rematch with Coric. Now, Coric retired from that match during the clay season against Tsitsipas. So, but I think Tsitsipas had the advantage. Tsitsipas can definitely take care of Coric. The problem for Tsitsipas will be Del Potro, which will be a rematch again from the clay season, where Del Po was able to take care of Tsitsipas at that point. But again, Tsitsipas is a new guy. He's always improving, always, I wouldn't say always improving. He has been demonstrating some substantial improvements. I've noticed, in fact, his serve toss has gotten higher. I'm not sure why he's doing that, but the backhand in particular, and he's got a beautiful one-hander. So who's going to win the U.S. Open? Well, that was in my headline. I mean, listen, I think the smart money is on Rafa Nadal. One of the comments that I got yesterday was on the streaming video later, when I think it was an individual from Australia, in fact, who comments quite a bit. But I think that the point was that he made is that Rafa is the defending champion, but he did have that really clean, some would call it easy draw last year. So that is one kind of wrinkle in that. Let's look at just to remind ourselves now. So the point being is that Nadal has maybe even though I was making the point yesterday that Nadal's draw looks pretty easy, pretty clean this year as well. The commenter was saying that it's going to be harder this year for him. To remind you, Nadal's biggest challenges prior to the final could be Edmund in the round of 16, could be Anderson or Thiem possibly in the quarterfinals, and in the semifinals, possibly Delpo, likely Delpo, maybe Tsitsipas, maybe Isner. There's a number of different possibilities there, but that's it. That's it before the final. Rafa's looking pretty clean into the final. I mean, there's no insurmountable barriers there into the final, folks. But again, the point of the commenter is, well, last year was so easy for Nadal. So let's look at, just to remind ourselves, let's look at Nadal's run through the U.S. Open last year. Let me see here. I could probably do a lot of it on memory, but I just want to go through and do a kind of side-by-side comparison of the of his run last year. And I do remember it was, of course, he didn't have to deal with Roger. Of course, he didn't have to deal with folks like Stan, didn't have to deal with Djokovic. I believe there was a match against Del Potro, right? Didn't he beat Del Potro after Roger fell to Del Potro? I think so. Let's see here, 2017. Grand Slams. And let's just see what the run looked like. Dusan Lajovic in the first round. Now we're talking about Nadal's run through the U.S. Open last year for purposes of doing a comparative analysis with his potential run this year. He took out Dusan Lajovic, 7-6, 6-2, 6-2. Lajovic can play. He took out Taro Daniel in the second round, and that was a 4-set match against Taro Daniel. Another point, check mark for Taro Daniel. I mean, there he was, kind of, giving Nadal, the great Nadal, a hard time. It was 4-6, 6-3, 6-2, 6-2. Nadal winning. Leonardo Meyer, no slouch in the next round, and that was a 4-set match. Dolgopolov in the fourth round. That was a straight set win. Andrei Rublev in the quarterfinals. Very strong player. That was a straight set win. Then, of course, in the semifinals, it was Del Potro. And then in the finals, Kevin Anderson. Well, as I'm looking at that now, I think I do agree that last year was probably easier the way it actually worked out. The likely run that Nadal will have here at the U.S. Open will involve some stiffer competition. So that's the truth. There's no question about that. I still think relative to Roger's draw, Nadal is looking pretty safe. Not safe as houses, as they would say in England, but fairly safe. He's demonstrably superior to the players that he'll have to deal with, say, prior to the semifinal, really prior to the final. His run into the final is clean, if you ask me. Now, Djokovic in the final, well, that's just a different story. That's a new factor that just wasn't present, and it didn't have to be dealt with last year. But I do think that it's a fairly easy run. It's going to be more competitive. So I like that nuance on that. Nadal's run, for those of you tuning in, Nadal's draw this year looks clean and fairly doable. It's a good word for it. Certainly into the final. But on the other hand, it looks a little more competitive than last year. But if you look at Federer, it's all different, right? In the third round, Federer's got to deal with the Aussie, Nick Kyrgios, who we've been talking about, the man who believes that Tsitsipas is not a good tennis player. He actually said that. But for those of you just tuning in, it wasn't the whole quote. He also did say that he believes Tsitsipas will get better as the time passes. Well, again, I'm just kind of coming to this conclusion, but it looks like there's a little bit of tension there between folks on the one hand like Alexander Zverev and Nick Kyrgios, and on the other hand this up-and-comer Stefanos Tsitsipas. Well, I've always maintained, I know a lot of you like to believe that these tennis players are, they're such good friends, and they hang out and have beers together, and they're just, there's a lot of collegiality on the tour, and that's not what I see. When I see the handshakes, when I see how these players interact, even with Roger and Rafa, to be honest, I mean, it's pretty cold, folks. I don't think that they get too friendly. I don't think they're terribly friendly with each other. I don't think you could call many of them. There probably are some exceptions. I mean, you'd think that Stan and Roger, being countrymen, would have a friendship of sorts. But then, man, you remember that Merkagate thing, and there's some tensions with Stan. There's tensions with Stan, even a fellow Swiss, with Roger. So it's tense with these guys, to be honest. It's part of what adds to the drama. I think they have a lot of respect for each other, but they're not friends. They're not friendly. Yeah, Merkagate, pretty funny stuff. Let me take some comments here. Aaron, Nadal has a joke of a draw. Nadal's Grand Slam draws have become like Hollywood movies, says Interi. We all know what to expect. It's not the first time and will not be the last time Nadal gets easy draws. Well, I'm not sure if it's intended. I can't imagine that it's intended that Nadal had an easy draw. But did you just listen to me? I went through the draw last year at the U.S. Open in Terry, and I think last year's U.S. Open draw was easier. So relatively speaking, Nadal has a harder draw. It's not as hard as Rogers. It's not as hard as many of the other players, to be honest. But it's a little harder than last year. So that's a fair point that I was getting from a commenter. Yeah, Zahed, Kazi, Nadal will win this year. I mean, that's where I am. But you do have the Djokovic factor. He just wasn't around. Here are the two things that could happen. I talked about this yesterday. The two things that could happen that could really make things interesting, really mix things up. One thing that could happen, and it's interesting that I'm saying this would mix things up. Right now, there's not a lot of expectations around Roger Federer in this U.S. Open, I can tell you that. Not a lot of great expectations that are surrounding Federer. But if Federer is able, I said this yesterday, and for you Fed fans, listen up, because this is important. I think it's the truth. If Federer can push through Kyrgios, if he can push through, say, Chung or Fognini in the round of four, and then most importantly, if he can push through Djokovic, and I think he can, in the quarterfinals and land a spot in the semifinal, well, at that moment in time, the moment in time that he potentially beats Djokovic and lands a spot in the semifinal, I would, at that point, if that happens, call him the favorite to win the tournament and his sixth U.S. Open title. The reason I say that is because if he plows through Kyrgios and plows through Djokovic, and assuming Djokovic doesn't, play really badly, doesn't have a total breakdown during that match, assuming he pushes through a legitimate Djokovic. He pushes through a Djokovic that's playing at a very respectable level. Well, that's going to say a lot about where Roger is, about how he's playing. And I think to the extent that Roger comes through Kyrgios and Djokovic to land a spot in the semifinal, he will be my new favorite to win the tournament. The reason? In the semis, Roger could at worst have to deal with Cilic, possibly Goffin, possibly Zverev. Those are probably the three most likely picks for a semifinal opponent against Federer should Federer make it into the semifinal. And I think, again, if Federer comes through Kyrgios and Djokovic, I think he would prove himself capable of dealing with either Cilic, Goffin, or Zverev. And then if Nadal's in the final, well, we know that Roger Federer knows how to do jobs on Rafa Nadal. He learned how to do it. At some point, the last 5 meetings have been wins over Nadal. I think Nadal does lead in the overall head-to-head. But so I've said it twice. If Nadal makes it into the final, Nadal gets a spot in the semifinals, having come through Djokovic, he'll probably win the tournament. Because Nadal's not going to be able to stop him at that point, I don't think, folks. Unhinged Obesity needs the neo backhand if he wants to beat Rafa. Yeah, he does need to start swinging through the backhands a little more. Now, remember, the neo backhand came to fame during the Australian Open in 2017, and those courts, those indoor hard courts, play. I suppose are they not all indoor? But those hard courts play very fast compared to the U.S. Open, according to my understanding. So the neo backhand can only be of so much value if the courts are slow as molasses, particularly against someone like Rafa Nadal. So we'll have to see. One thing I was going to mention about the courts is that they're constantly tweaking them. So how the speed at which they played last year is not necessarily an indicator of what will happen this year or how the courts will be playing this year. So it changes. They tweak the surfaces. They do. And so we'll just have to see. We're going to have to watch very closely to see how they are, how they're playing. Listen, for those of you tuning in, I wanted to mention that remember when you're subscribing to the channel to hit that little bell icon next to the subscribe button so you get notifications of these live streams. And YouTube added that a while back. Next to the subscribe button, there's a little bell icon, and you got to hit that bell icon if you want to get notices of the live streams coming in, Tennis Talk Daily exclusive live content. And we're talking pretty much nonstop. Well, we did a 2-hour stream yesterday. That was fun. We filled up 2 hours with some great discussion. It was awesome. I mean, the talk never ends, really. There's always something to talk about. But remember to get that bell icon clicked because that will give you the notifications. What else did I want to talk about today? I basically covered much of the other two players that I wanted to look at the 2018 season on would be Chung and Goffin. Chung, I guess we really don't have to say too much about Chung. What we say about Chung is that, listen, he was impressing at the Aussie Open. He was impressing on the hard courts of Indian Wells, but something happened with Chung. You know, he was shut out of the Winston-Salem tournament as well recently in straight sets, I believe. So something not quite right with him. Of course, he's young. He's got lots of time, but I don't think I'm going to go through that whole exercise. And in terms of Goffin, he's a little more interesting in terms of looking what his year has been like. I mean, could this be a breakthrough year? I mean, what I saw in Goffin in Cincinnati was very impressive. He seemed to be a better player. I mean, let me know what you think about that. I mean, he he did seem to have kind of stepped up his game a little bit. But I noticed that with a couple of the different players, with Cilic and Raonic, they were just devastating from the ground. Djokovic was able to get through both of them, but you watch those matches, they were 3-set matches. So, of course, Cilic had a little time in the limelight. Raonic had a little time in the limelight when they were winning their sole sets within those matches. But let's look at Goffin's year. I don't think it's been a super stellar year for him, but let's just look. With Taro Daniel, there's been one title this year. That was the Istanbul Open, which was his first and only title. So this year for Goffin, let's go through what he's done this year. At the Australian Open, he was out in the second round, lost to Julian Benneteau in a 4-set match that included a couple of tiebreakers. Then there was a French tournament, Montpellier, at 250 level. He lost to Richard Gasquet after beating Gilles Simon and Karen Khachanov. Had a better run in Rotterdam. Goffin came through Nicolas Mahut, Feliciano Lopez, Thomas Burdick, and then fell to Grigor Dimitrov in Rotterdam. Oh, excuse me. No, he had to retire from the Grigor Dimitrov match in Rotterdam. And so, he does that sometimes. Is that a pattern with him? Does he retire a lot? I'm not entirely sure. He loses big time in Miami to Hal Sosa, to the grunting Hal Sosa. I was saying before, Hal Sosa, I think, has got to be the loudest grunter on the tour. LSB responded that Nadal is the loudest grunter. Well, possibly. I think it's Hal Sosa, to be honest. I think Nadal's very consistent with his grunting, whereas Sosa isn't. But then in Monte Carlo, he defeats the up-and-coming Stefanos Tsitsipas in the second round, which was his opening round. Also defeats Bautista Agut before falling this time fairly and squarely to Grigor Dimitrov in the quarterfinals. Goffin has problems with Dimitrov, has historically had some problems. Let's see if there's any other matches. They often meet. Goffin and Dimitrov often meet, those two lost-gen players pitted against each other. At Barcelona, defeated Khachanov again, defeated Bautista Agut, lost to Nadal. We're talking about David Goffin's 2018 tennis season. For those of you tuning in, Goffin, after prevailing against Khachanov and Bautista Agut in Barcelona, fell to Nadal in the semifinal in straight sets, which included a bagel. Oh, dear. In, let's see, Madrid, fell to Kyle Edmund. In Rome, he beats Del Potro, beat Leonardo Mayer, but fell to Zverev in the quarterfinals at Roland Garros. Has a run into the round of 16 where Marco Cecchinato beat David Goffin, as you recall, in Roland Garros. Cecchinato was really kicking butt in Paris. And that was kind of his breakthrough tournament, of course. Nothing much. He Goffin out in the first round at Wimbledon, a very disappointing loss. In straight sets, he lost to Matthew Ebden. I don't think he's very good on the grass. He did also play at Queen's Club and lost in the first round to Feliciano Lopez. Now, Feliciano Lopez is a very good grass player. He's in fact, when he's playing well, he's really kind of one of the best grass players on the tour. Of course, he's getting old now. Matthew Ebden is also a very fine grass player. So Goffin, maybe we could excuse those losses. He's not great on the grass. And then coming into Washington, Goffin scores wins against Francis Tiafoe, then loses in the quarterfinals to Tsitsipas. As we were saying before, that was a straight set loss. Rogers Cup, Goffin loses in the opening round to Raonic. But then, of course, at Cincinnati, he has a very deep run into the semifinals. Ultimately, he does have to retire in the match against Roger Federer, but not before beating Tsitsipas, Benoit Paire, Benoit Sorry. It's an issue of major contention on this channel, how to pronounce the bearded madman's first name. It's Benoit Paire, and then Kevin Anderson. Goffin defeated, straight set victory over Del Potro. Of course, it wasn't the cleanest victory with the biggest margin. 2 tie breaks, 7-6, 7-6 over Del Potro. A very close match. When I read those stats and numbers after the match, I was amazed at basically how level that match was on pretty much all the key stats. It was very close. So Goffin, maybe we can conclude, is performing up to about the same level of a Del Potro. Well, if that's the case, if Goffin is performing as well as Del Potro, that puts him in pretty good stead for the U.S. Open, doesn't it? Yeah. I think Goffin is a force to be reckoned with. What do you guys think? He is my favorite double fister on the tour. Folks are talking about Raonic. Well, listen. Raonic in the match against Djokovic at Cincinnati was playing very well and landing his forehands and backhands. I mean, he's just playing very well from the baseline. Obviously, Raonic brings a tremendous serve. He also brings that kind of cartoonish hair. He's such a big guy. He's not tall and thin. He's like tall and big. You know, it's almost like he could be a football player or something. But with that hair, never could be a football player. They would never let him in the NFL with that hair. There's got to be some kind of NFL regulation against cartoon hair. But Raonic is a force to be reckoned with. I mean, the last time he's had some pretty good runs. We could look at his year too. I mean, he was, I think, the big hope for many back in 2015, 2016. He had some very impressive runs. Of course, was in the Wimbledon final. Let's look at some of his numbers and some of his results from this year. If Raonic is to go far, I mean, what does Raonic need to do? Well, Raonic is going to need to possibly, he's going to be having to deal with Jared Donaldson in the opener, which shouldn't be too big of a deal. Possibly Gilles Simon in the second round. And then in the third round, it could get interesting for Raonic. He might have to deal with either Wawrinka or Dimitrov. And if he can get to the fourth round, it would be Raonic versus probably Isner, if Isner can push through. And if he can get past Isner, then he's going to have his work cut out for him. It could be Delpo waiting for him on the other side of the court in the quarterfinals. And if he could push through Delpo, then he's going to have to probably deal with Rafa Nadal in the semifinals. So that could be very hard. But listen, I could see a semifinal run for Raonic. Let's just review a little bit about what Raonic has been doing this year. The runs he's had this year, I don't think he's won any titles this year. Brisbane, he was out in the second round. He lost to Alex de Minaur. Lost to Lucas Lachko at the Australian Open in the first round. Was able to beat Taro Daniel in Delray Beach. Had a fairly deep run at Indian Wells. Oh, yes, this is where Raonic started to shine at Indian Wells. He came through Hal Sosa, the big grunter who keeps coming up, and then also pushed through Sam Querrey in 3 sets before falling ultimately in straight sets to Del Potro. But that was a impressive run, semifinal run at Indian Wells. Then he went to the quarterfinals at Miami, fell to Del Potro again. This time, however, in 3 sets. So, contrast that to David Goffin, who has been beating Del Potro rather than losing to him, as Raonic has been doing. During the clay season, let's see, any impressive matches? He took care of Dimitrov in the second round of Madrid before falling to Shapo in the fourth round at Madrid. In Stuttgart, again, good run. Remember, he was in the final against Stuttgart. That was one of my best predictions this year. At the beginning of that tournament, I looked at the draw and I said, yeah, it's probably going to be Federer versus Raonic in the final. Then I had a viewer come on, and I'm not always right in my predictions. I had a viewer come on and say, man, you're good. He's like, I've been doing some betting. Can we do some consultations? He wanted some info from me so he could try to make some money. Well, I'm not a tennis bettor, but I'm gaining confidence in some of these predictions. A lot of this stuff is kind of unpredictable, but I know you have all kinds of variations in terms of the odds that you can factor into betting. But a very impressive run there at Stuttgart, which is a 250 level tournament, but really kind of the caliber of the competition at Stuttgart this year suggested more of a 500 level tournament, to be honest. In any case, Raonic came through Fucsovics, not Fuskovics, as Jim Courier likes to say. Jim Courier likes to call him Fuskovics, which is kind of, if you sound out all the letters in English, but I have an inside source that apprises me that it's Fucsovics. Fucsovics. Why does Goffin put you out or put you off, Amal K? Do explain. Divine David is one of my faves. Yeah, the Stuttgart win was a nice silver lining for Roger. That was a good one. Remember, he was able to get to the number one position. I think that was in the semifinal, right? By virtue of winning the semi, or was it by virtue of winning the quarter? I forget. In any case, for Raonic, came through Burdick, came through Luca Pouille, fell to the greatest grass court player of all time, arguably Roger Federer. At Queen's Club, where Raonic should have been performing, Raonic has done well on grass, folks. I wouldn't call him a grass specialist, but he's done very well on grass over the course of his career and had posted some of his best results, in fact. So that is... At Queen's Club, he came through Yuki Bambury in the first round, but then fell to Feliciano Lopez. No, withdrew. I'm sorry. He withdrew from Queen's Club after winning that first match. Actually, Yuki Bambury retired from that match. I believe, however, that yes, that Raonic did ultimately withdraw. At Wimbledon, Raonic has a quarterfinal run. And lost to Isner in the quarterfinal, not before coming through John Millman, Dennis Novak, Mackenzie McDonald. Man, that was kind of a pretty easy run into the quarterfinals at Wimbledon this year. I wasn't paying attention too closely to Raonic, but ultimately falls to the giant, the tower of power, John Isner.